Today we see Jesus making an unexpected journey. And we are invited, I think, to have an underlying question that's this: what should we expect effective faith to accomplish? And so I've entitled my talk Effective Change, and we'll be looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. There exists in all of us the desire to be part of a big story, to be more than average. We'd all like to be one of those people about whom others look at and say, wow, I wish my life was like theirs. So, what happens when it feels as if it's only other people that live out our own dreams? Some of us feel so low that achieving average would be a big improvement. I think that's how the two people to which today's scripture draws attention felt. They were so far down that rising to average was an impossibly high goal. Just maybe they weren't the only ones within these encounters who felt as if their well laid plans were in danger of going awry. As we read this scripture, we encounter Jesus visiting the communities of Tyre and Sidon. Even though at first glance these encounters sound innocent, they raise some questions. What was Jesus doing in places like Tyre and Sidon? Why did it appear that Jesus was trying to avoid people? Yes, Jesus was divine, but he was also human. And the human reality of his mission may have caught up to him just as it would later in the Garden of Gethsemane. Tyre and Sidon were Phoenician cities north of the Jewish region of Galilee, in what is today Lebanon, and they were distinctly not Jewish. There's the uncomfortable suggestion that Jesus had gone into hiding because while in these locations, he kept asking people not to advertise that he was there. Other than the one previous trip across the Sea of Galilee to the region of the Gerasenes, where Jesus and his disciples encountered the crazed man who lived among tombs and where the herd of pigs ended up drowning, Mark's account had kept Jesus within the familiar boundaries of Jewish communities. There are numerous reasons why Jesus might have left Jewish territory, not least that his welcome was wearing thin. Herod, the Roman king over the Jewish region of Galilee, had recently executed John the Baptist, and he likely did not have a favorable disposition toward Jesus, who gave every appearance of being an associate of John. Not only did Jesus have reason to distrust the political authorities, but he had antagonized the religious authorities by nullifying some of their most sacred rules. Jesus had deeply offended them by proclaiming that their prized traditions were useless in guarding against the defilement that has its root in the human heart. He'd even gone as far as announcing that their famous dietary laws were unnecessary. The growing hostility Jesus was provoking makes it possible that Jesus concluded the prudent thing to do was for him to go to a region where he could lay low and avoid people, though he may also have had another motive. Bible scholars think it's possible that Jesus' expedition to Gentile territory lasted for 6 to 8 months. The impression we get is that this detour ended up being a time of intensive teaching for the disciples. The reason that appears possible is that the 12 disciples were much more decisive about who Jesus was after this excursion than before. Previously, they were continuously surprised at Jesus when he performed miracles like the feeding of 5,000 men plus all the women and children. And And when he calmed the stormy sea by just speaking to it, they wondered, who is this? Who is this? But upon their return, Peter would boldly state that Jesus was the promised Messiah. All of this invites us to look for clues as to Jesus' own state of mind as we read this whole section in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 37. This is what it says. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First, let the children eat all they want," Jesus told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of Decapolis. Just in a bit of a note there. So Sidon was actually north, further away from Galilee than Tyre. So he made a loop, and so this just describes the whole loop, and he eventually ended up back in Galilee. But back in Sidon, there some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. Then after he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spat and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said, "Ephphatha," which means, "Be opened." At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. "He has done everything well," they said. "He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." Despite having left the familiarity of Jewish regions, Jesus' fame had preceded him, forcing him to become a reluctant healer. It's as if we don't quite recognize Jesus in these two encounters. The teacher who previously had compassion on the crowds because he said they were like sheep without a shepherd appears almost callous. The Phoenician woman who came to Jesus begging him to heal her demon-possessed daughter reminds us of Jairus, who had previously pleaded with Jesus about his own dying daughter. But unlike Jesus' eager response to Jairus, Jesus attempted to brush this woman aside. "First, let the children eat all they want," Jesus told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Wow. Did Jesus call this woman a dog? Because if he did, it was one of the most demeaning insults he could have used. This woman, though, was not about to be kicked aside. Probably to lessen the insult and perhaps to invite a further response from the woman, Jesus' word choice referenced a small dog or a puppy, if indeed that made the insult more palatable. And so, despite knowing her place as a Gentile Phoenician woman and understanding Jesus to say that his ministry was directed toward Jewish people, The woman dared to engage Jesus in a verbal sparring match. The significant element of the whole encounter was that the woman was not put off by the insult. Perhaps she saw something in Jesus' demeanor that led her to believe that Jesus wasn't as serious as he sounded. Or maybe she was determined enough that insults wouldn't stop her. Either way, she had a quick comeback and said, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." The end result was that her daughter was healed. The second healing was notable for the technique Jesus used. Like he did in response to the man born blind as recorded in John chapter 9, Jesus used saliva as part of his healing of a man who was not able to hear and speak. Of the gospel writers, only Mark records the details of this miracle where Jesus placed his fingers in the man's ears and put saliva on the man's tongue in what was surely an unorthodox method of healing. True, in that era, saliva was considered to have healing properties, but the way Jesus pulled the man aside indicated there was an awkwardness about the encounter. Notably, after both healings, Jesus, in a totally fruitless effort, commanded the people to not tell anyone what he had done. It was as if Jesus was intent on avoiding people seeking him only to obtain miracles. More than just being interesting stories, the two healings in Tyre and Sidon give us unique insights into the working of faith. Granted, both people in this scripture received the miracle they each sought, but we also get to witness the drama of engaging God. We are intended to see that the Phoenician woman was able to turn the mind of Jesus through her determined debate. Apparently, the process of contending with God does more to accomplish faith than the end result. This is important because the chronicle of healings in the Bible can be disheartening for all those who do not receive the miracles they seek. We like to celebrate stories of healing which can leave those who don't receive the big miracle feeling as if their faith has failed. We should remember these words from Hebrews 11, which say this about the heroes of faith, if you're familiar with that whole chapter, which lists what we call it's the faith chapter and lists all the heroes of faith. And it says this in verse 13, Hebrews 11:13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. It wasn't any big miracle, but a commitment to contending with God that produced their faith. Through contending with God, we discover for ourselves that there is a God who listens and who views our complaints as valid. God invites us to be like children who do not always expect their parents to solve their problems, but who rightly long for their parents to hear their complaint and to give validity to their complaints. In addition to the importance of contending with God, these encounters bring up the issue of desperation. Now, I confess that I have been guilty of disparaging the idea of only turning to God in times of desperation. Genuine faith, I've assumed, turns to God in both good times and bad. The reality, though, is that desperation is what often drives us to faith. As I was preparing this sermon, I came across the idea that it can be hard to see where desperation ends and faith begins. I was pointed to Psalm 69, in which David pours out his desperation to God without ever claiming to have received a big miracle. Listen to what David wrote in the beginning verses of Psalm 69, and you may find yourself within the desperation of his words. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths where there is no foothold. I have come into the deep waters, the floods engulf me. I am worn out, calling for help. My throat is parched, my eyes fail, looking for my God. Those who hate me without reason outnumber the hairs of my head. Words of desperation. While it is true that faith is sometimes quiet and steadfast, faith is often a loud cry of desperation. There's ample evidence in the Bible that God welcomes those who cry out in desperation, and we should never feel badly for turning to God when we feel desperate. Our desperate plea just might be the cry of faith. The conclusion we can't avoid is that the Bible would want us to understand that it is wrong to measure our faith by the degree to which we receive the miracle we seek. The greatest accomplishment of faith is revealed through changing us, not through changing our circumstances. This is not the answer we are often hoping for, but it is the answer that has, without doubt, the biggest long-term impact.